So Charlottesville is a seminal moment in this country for hate.
Oren Siegel tracks the white supremacist transformation as director of the Center on Extremism at the Anti-Defamation League.
The data tells us this: 74% of extremist-related killings in this country in the last 10 years have been carried out by right-wing extremists.
Today, 11 separate Jewish community centers receiving similar threatening calls. Since early January, 54 centers targeted across 27 states.
Officials say dozens of headstones were broken and toppled at the Mount Carmel Cemetery. The report comes less than a week after more than 150 headstones were vandalized at a Jewish cemetery in St. Louis.
Since the election in November 2016, we've seen nearly a doubling of incidences of bullying and harassment, vandalism and violence in K-12 schools year over year.
The number of anti-Semitic incidents in the United States surged in 2017, increasing by 57%, according to a new report by the Anti-Defamation League.
He talked about their grip in Hollywood and how the Jews were responsible for all of this filth and degenerate behavior.
This is Gary Cohn's last meeting in the cabinet and of the cabinet, and he's been terrific. He may be a globalist, but I still like him. He is seriously a globalist, there's no question.
Mark Pitkavich of the Anti-Defamation League tells the New York Times the far right uses globalism as shorthand for a worldview based on racism, xenophobia, and anti-Semitism.
But last year, America had its second highest number of reported incidents of harassment, vandalism, or assaults against Jews or Jewish institutions since records began in 1979, with nearly 2,000 such incidents. The ADL says it was the largest single-year increase on record.
Lucky. It's one of the privileges of the job to have the opportunity to be on a panel like this with such an esteemed group of people. And that video we showed was pretty sobering. And all of these individuals, as journalists and writers, as bloggers and tweeters, have experienced this firsthand. So we're going to spend the session here this afternoon kind of delving into their work, explain a little bit about what they've learned, and maybe challenge a little bit. I think it's a lot more fun. So to my immediate left is Jonathan Weisman. Jonathan is the deputy Washington editor of the New York Times. He's the author of a new book about his own experiences in dealing with anti-Semitism, particularly accentuated through the 2016 election season, called Semitism, that I recommend to all of you. In the middle, we have Bari Weiss. Bari Weiss is the staff editor and writer for the opinion section of the New York Times. She is a terrific, sage writer who has been, I think, an important voice on these issues in a way which has, I think, challenged the status quo, and we'll talk about that. And then lastly, Yair Rosenberg, who's a senior writer on Tablet. And literally, if there is a Jewish voice you are following on Twitter, it should be Yair Rosenberg, who has been a smart, sober, and honestly centered voice on these issues, pushing back on anti-Semitism from all sides. So please join me in thanking all of our panelists for being up here today. So again, I'm just going to set the stage and recap a little bit of what was touched on briefly in that video. So last year, we saw nearly a 60% increase in anti-Semitic incidents here in the US, the largest single-year spike we've seen since we started recording anti-Semitic incidents in 1979. I'm talking about nearly 2,000 acts of harassment, vandalism, and violence. This came on top of a 35% increase that we observed in 2016. And we've seen a surge of incidents in particular sectors. So last year we saw nearly doubling of anti-Semitic bullying and harassment and vandalism at K-12 schools, and a 90% increase on colleges and universities. And at colleges and universities, of course, it takes many forms. We're not even counting the anti-Israel BDS campaigns that many people think we should be counting, and we can talk about that as well. So let's not forget that Charlottesville was just 9 months ago, where literally just 2 hours from here, we had neo-Nazis marching in our streets, and we can talk about whether or not we should take the threat of Richard Spencer and his ilk seriously. There's been much written about of late about how they're all unraveling. But make no mistake, the idea that these people would feel comfortable in plain sight to chant and march the way they did, to convene from around the country, suggests a new reality that I think many of us didn't even realize was here. And in addition to all of this, what's happening in real life, again, what's happening online accentuates many of these issues. We just released the report this morning on Twitter. Hopefully all of you have looked at it on your phones already. I mean, we found, if you haven't seen it yet, millions and millions and millions of anti-Semitic tweets in the past year, millions of accounts that are pushing these things out there. And it's simply I think it's become the norm that anti-Semitism is now part of the public conversation. So let's open up this panel with, I've made that assertion. Jonathan, I think anti-Semitism is part of your lived experience online. Talk to us a little bit about this and whether or not we should accept it as just part of the public dialogue and discourse today.
Well, real quickly, I'll tell you the origins of my experiences. I wasn't a particularly observant Jew. I didn't think much about it. And in 2016, it was it was May of 2016, I had tweeted out a copy of a link and a quote from an op-ed by Robert Kaplan that said, this is how fascism comes to America. And I got something back from somebody who called himself Cyber-Trump saying, hello, Weisman. That's it, hello, Weisman, except the Weisman was in 3 parentheses. Now, I had never seen this notation before, but I kind of intuited that Weisman is a Jewish-sounding name. This must have something to do with that. And I said, care to explain? And he came back at me with, what ho, the vaunted Ashkenazi intelligence. It was a dog whistle, fool. I have belled the cat for my fellow Goyim. And then this absolute deluge of anti-Semitic hate came at me, because as it turns out, those 3 parentheses were actually a marker that people who had downloaded a certain piece of software could use to target Jewish journalists. The ADL ranked those attacks. I came out number 5. Yair, number 2.
And Ben Shapiro, number 1.
Number 1.
That's right. So, and this is just something that we are living with, but I have to say, when I wrote my book, Semitism, as I was writing it, initially it was going to be about my experience online, but as I was writing it, we had an incident where a young black student at College Park, Maryland, not very far from here, was standing at a bus stop. A follower of the alt-right came up and demanded that he step aside. He didn't step aside. He was stabbed to death. Literally just a few days after that, a young Muslim woman in a hijab was being screamed at by a follower of the alt-right. 2 men stood up to him, and they were stabbed to death in broad daylight in Portland on the Portland light rail. And these things go, I could cite chapter and verse. We don't even have to get into Charlottesville. So let me be clear. This is a phenomenon that has jumped off of the internet and into the real world.
It's really pretty shocking. And I would tell you, how did you respond when it came at you? In fact, let me actually push the conversation a little further. From what I remember, you decided to retreat from Twitter. You said, as they say, Dayenu. Is that a fair characterization of what happened?
Well, at first it's...
And you can explain.
At first, I had a fair number of Twitter followers, not like, Kanye West levels, but a fair...
Oh, Kanye.
But
that's a whole other panel.
But at first it was coming over. I was so shocked by the imagery because it was so from my childhood. My upbringing at a very, very Reformed temple in Atlanta. My Jewish upbringing was kind of a tour of anti-Semitism past. It was like Jewish history, hate through the ages, and I started seeing the exact same images that I learned about from Tsarist Russia and Nazi Germany. I was so amazed and shocked by it that I would just retweet it to let everyone see it, until somebody named Jonathan Greenblatt called up and said, I see what you're doing, but maybe you should stop doing that.
Yeah, that was...
So then I did. I said, you know what, I've had enough. I tried to get Twitter to engage. I would send the most offensive things to them. I actually had somebody from the New York Times bundle the very most violent images, send it to Twitter saying, what are you going to do with it?
Right.
It kept coming back saying this is not a violation of our terms of service, which seemed so crazy to me. And so finally I said, forget it, I'm going to drop out of Twitter. But the fact of the matter is a journalist in this day and age can't be off Twitter. So I was off for like 3 months and went back on.
Right. So, and again, any conclusions you draw from the experience, though, as you think about where we...
I like to put this moment in American anti-Semitism and bigotry into the global context. Because, you know, what we are seeing in Poland, what we are seeing in Greece with Golden Dawn, what we are seeing in Orban's Hungary, what we just saw with the parliamentary elections in Italy, this is all of a piece.
Mm-hmm.
And we might talk about the fragmentation of the alt-right and the fighting between the Richard Spencer camp and the, you know, Mike Cernovich camp. But the fact is, I think that they're looking for a spark, looking for a leader, and we're in a moment where the rise of white nationalism, of this kind of bigotry as an organizational term with which to build a political movement, we're just seeing the beginning of that in the United States, and I just think vigilance is what is called for.
So I take, can I jump in?
Yeah, I was going to go to you next.
I take that tour of Europe seriously, and I think everything that Jonathan just said is true about what's going on in Greece, what's going on in Poland. But I think it's notable, and I think it's notable in general with our conversations about anti-Semitism, what we leave out and what we focus on. That tour of Europe misses the Labour Party in England, and it misses what's going on in France right now, which is by far the biggest threat to Jews in the world. Holocaust survivor Mariel Knoll lynched in her own home, Sarah Halimi thrown from her balcony, murdered, while the person who murdered her was screaming Allahu Akbar. I think there's a reason for this. I think that it is very, very easy. As Jews, you know, we generally see ourselves sort of the liberal left, and it is much, much harder, I think, to call out anti-Semitism from within our own tribe, so to speak. It's very, very easy to call out people like Richard Spencer and Mike Cernovich. They're so obviously bad. Their anti-Semitism is not subtle in any way. I think what's far more difficult is to call it out from within our own ranks, so to speak, and at least in this country, that means from the left.
So let's talk a little bit about that. You know, I mentioned this in my remarks last night, how this kind of rubric of intersectionality, which purports to be inclusive, manages to exclude many, many Jews, most Jews, on their own terms. Literally, when they believe in the right of Jews to self-determination, when they believe in being kind of proud about their heritage. Talk to me a little bit, if you would, or talk to all of us, Bari, about this complexity of this anti-Semitism as it's kind of manifesting on the left, because it seems to me that it's a different kind of intolerance that's equally pernicious. Am I getting that right? Or?
Yeah, I think, yes, and I think it's painful and hard, both because, again, we want to see ourselves as part of it, right? We want to be intersectional, because intersectionality at its best sounds like, you know, the greatest vision in the world, where, you know, those of us who have been historically oppressed can kind of make common cause and fight our oppressors together. But in reality, it functions like a sort of caste system in which the most oppressed sort of have a higher claim on truth, and that their narrative is more true than another. I mean, frankly, I think what we saw, not to make things awkward, but what we saw in the ADL Starbucks moment was a perfect expression of intersectionality at work.
Making things awkward.
Sorry.
No. It's a fair statement and a fair assertion.
I don't know, I'm wondering
but
if
I want to go to Yair in a second, but just to push back a little bit. I mean, I think part of the dialogue for many on the, let's say, the left, if you will, is that we need to hear voices that historically have not been heard. And so how do we create a space to hear those marginalized voices, which for too long were literally not part of these mainstream conversations, while ensuring they accommodate for our voice and for other voices?
Well, right.
How do we balance those equities, Bari?
I think it's fairly straightforward, which is saying, just as you should not have to check any part of your identity at the door, just so we Jews, or specifically this comes up a lot with Israel, we Zionist Jews, should not have to check ours. And the notion that we're sort of being whitewashed as, you know, white oppressor, colonialist. I mean, and again, this bleeds very much into the Israel conversation, which is viewed in this view of the world. It's the last standing bastion of white colonialism in the Middle East. And so where does you know, a person that supports that, where do they have a role to play in this new intersectional vision that's really, really quickly taken over the left? And I think we need to be insistent that we can be both progressive and fully Jewish, and Israel has a lot to do with that. I don't think we can separate it out. And I don't think we should be asked to check that at the door.
So, Yair, I literally often see you in the middle of these discussions.
Yeah, he should be sitting right here.
Maybe he should. So tell us how you kind of square, I don't think these are competing narratives, but what Bari's really kind of laying out, which is the challenge for Jews of being present in these progressive circles and at the same time have a difficult, you know, it's difficult for them to bring, again, their own sense of identity and self.
Well, first I just want to say thank you to everyone who's here. Like I was saying backstage, I think what I tweet about, the ADL does things about. So it's good to see all of you here, and thank you for what you do. As for the question, as you know, when you have Jonathan up here describing these sorts of right-wing manifestations of anti-Semitism, and Bari describing left-wing manifestations of anti-Semitism, or anti-Semitism that might stem from the Muslim community in France, so this is a conversation you can imagine as a reporter covering this stuff. I hear a lot, which is I'll write about anti-Semitism in a particular community or from a particular ideological group or population. And people affiliated with that community will turn around and say to me, yeah, but the real anti-Semites, they're the ones on college campuses, right? Not you know, these bad apples on the right that the media inflates. Or the real anti-Semites, you know, are the ones on the alt-right. After all, look, Donald Trump is our president, and we don't, you know, there are some bad apples here on the left who say some things out of line, but like that's just being raised up to sort of distract from the real problem. And I actually think the real problem is that exact conversation that I just dramatized for you, because the only people who win when we fight over who is the real anti-Semite are the actual anti-Semites who keep being anti-Semites while we fight with each other instead of fighting them. So that's point one. Point two is that, and this pertains to what Bari was saying, even though anti-Semitism comes from all different communities and can infect any particular ideology, whether it's intersectionality or conservatism or a form of Christian nationalism, all of these have had their run-ins with anti-Semitism. The fact is that if you want to make a difference in fighting anti-Semitism, I've seen this again and again, you are going to have the most impact in a community that takes you seriously and that respects you as a member. Right? So if you're a member of the College Republicans and you go and break into, you know, the latest meeting of, you know, the campus progressives and say, you guys really need to get this, you know, BDS bleeding into anti-Semitism problem in order. So you might have had a good point, you might have real issues that you wanted to bring up, but they're A, gonna laugh you out of the room because you're not a member of their club, and B, they might get defensive and circle the wagons about something they might have been introspective about if it was raised in their own community. And the same thing is true if you're a progressive who barges into the Young Republicans chapter and makes the same point about the alt-right. Both of you sides could be making correct points, but we only really listen to people who we see as friends and peers. But of course, that also means that if you're my friend or my peer, I have to have an uncomfortable conversation with you about anti-Semitism in our own ranks. And that's really hard to do. So it's so much easier to make anti-Semitism the perpetual sin of other people and point at it elsewhere and not deal with it in our own backyards. And a lot of what I try to do, I talk far too fast for applause lines. A lot of what I try to do is sort of hold a mirror up to different communities and try to ask them to deal with their own issues internally and learn how to talk about this issue and have that conversation more constructively in their own space. And I think that's something that we really need to think about, which is how do we make that conversation a safe one to have in different communities? One, because people should be fighting this, fighting anti-Semitism or prejudice wherever it rears its head, but also because lots of people have assumptions about minority groups they don't know very well, whether they're Jews or African Americans or Latinos. And they're not necessarily bad people. They just need to have that conversation in a safe, constructive space, and they'll emerge better for it. But too often our fights are really vitriolic, and they basically end up short-circuiting the conversation before they begin, especially on social media.
So there's a lot of places I could go. I mean, one of the things I just want to say about Yair, he's not only a journalist, you're sort of an innovator. Can you just share quickly what you did in response to the hate that you were getting on Twitter, specifically thinking about the bot that you created, because I think it's an interesting story for everyone to hear.
What you wrote about for me.
Yeah, so I'm going to mention that soon. As Jonathan mentioned, the ADL did a study during the 2016 election and cataloged the different people getting anti-Semitic abuse online, different Jewish journalists. And I came in number 2, which made me something of an unintentional expert on all different sorts of far-right trolling in particular. And so I, basically had this weird array of expertise and didn't, quite know what to do with it. And then after the 2016 election, I was feeling like I need to do something useful and valuable in the world, not just do the tweeting part. And so I kind of, split the difference and did something useful, hopefully, on Twitter, which was working with a really fascinating developer based in San Francisco named Neil Chandra. We built a Twitter bot to expose a particular kind of anti-Semitic and otherwise racist troll on the platform. Briefly described, there are particular sort of white supremacist neo-Nazis who go online, find pictures of people who look like very visible minorities, so say a religious Muslim woman, a religious Jewish man, an African American, and then they take that picture, make it their avatar, and now masquerade on Twitter as that minority, and then insert themselves into conversations with people on Twitter, often very prominent users with large numbers of followers, so that many people will see the conversation. And they proceed to say something extraordinarily racist or offensive or cruel under the guise of being a minority. And if you think about it, it's rather ingenious, if not pernicious, because if you're a racist, what do you want more than anything in the world? For other people to hate the same people you hate. So what better way to do than to dress up as those people and do hateful things to make more people hate those people? And so when I was aware that these people were floating around, because I got so much of this stuff and I saw them as a subset of this trolling phenomenon. And this kind of worried me because this is actually more effective than many other kinds of trolling, where if you say something anti-Semitic with a swastika as your avatar, everyone knows what they're getting, and it's easy to dismiss. But if you're doing it and you look like a religious Hasidic Jew, right, that's a very different story. And it can fool a lot of unsuspecting people who would never know to look out for this on their digital platform. So we created a sort of bot, or what I like to call a golem for the internet, which would jump into conversations with these sorts of users. I had a database that we assembled, then was crowdsourced, and then carefully checked, lots of people that I interacted with, and that we could prove were fake Jews or fake Muslims. And whenever these fake Jews or fake Muslims tried to insinuate themselves into a conversation on Twitter, our bot would pop up and reply to the conversation and say, FYI, fake Jew. FYI, fake Muslim, don't waste your time. Now, it wasn't invasive, it didn't bump them off the platform, it didn't censor their free speech. It was literally the simplest of interventions, but it was extremely effective. The bot got thousands of followers. It got written up in a lot of places, raising awareness of this problem on the platform in the process. Up until Twitter shut down the bot for a variety of interesting reasons, which we can discuss another time. I eventually wrote an op-ed about it, if you want to learn more, for the New York Times, which was edited by a certain Bari Weiss. And that's something I think people should recognize, right? So Bari is known sometimes for the things that she writes in the New York Times, but much of what she does is actually editing other people and advancing arguments in that way. And she started as my editor at Tablet, and she edits a wide array of people at the New York Times, and I think that that's a really wonderful thing, a service that she's done on a lot of issues.
Hear, hear. So it's interesting.
Yay for everyone.
Part of this is interesting because your response to the hate, again, was to develop this bot, which I think was very clever and smart. What is the response of leaders when hate is kind of flourishing? So I'm going to ask this question on multiple levels and open it up to all of you. So I know we at the ADL often find ourselves the recipients of all kinds of charges and claims. What do you think should be the response of other Jewish communal leaders, maybe even political leaders, maybe even our president in the face of hate? Are they responsible to try to deal with the climate? Or rather, is it not their job to do that? I would just be curious how you might think about the role of leadership in this kind of environment of intolerance.
I mean, I think there's no question that there is a role for leaders all the way up to the president to respond, and the lack of response is deafening, right? So during the 2016 election, when all of this swirl of alt-right anti-Semitism and racism was shooting up, there was a moment where Wolf Blitzer asked candidate Trump what he thought of it, and he said, I don't control my followers. That was his response. There was a moment where when a Jewish journalist named Julia Yaffe had profiled Melania Trump in GQ, and Melania felt that she had strayed too far into her personal past and had said that she didn't like it. The alt-right then swarmed Julia Yaffe. Melania was asked about that, and she said, well, she provoked it. I mean, that is the absence, that is beyond the absence of leadership there. But I would also say, I think that mainline Jewish organizations have been remarkably diffident in this fight. And there was a moment I've mentioned before where the Anti-Defamation League put out a guide to the alt-right, alt-light, and there was a response from some of the figures that were profiled to call the Anti-Defamation League a hate group that was trying to whip up assassinations on their families. And there were two particular, Jack Posobiec and Mike Cernovich, who said that the Anti-Defamation League was trying to have them killed. And there were some voices on the Republican side. I'm thinking of Josh Mandel, who was then running for the Senate. He's Jewish, and he's the Republican treasurer of Ohio. He stood up and he said, I stand with Posobiec and Cernovich against the Anti-Defamation League, which was so insane, this notion that the Anti-Defamation League is being partisan for calling out bigotry is a kind of a new low in our politics, I think. But I didn't hear the other mainline Jewish organizations stand up for the Anti-Defamation League at that point, nor did I hear them stand up during the whole Starbucks kerfuffle. So I feel like right now there is a diffidence in the Jewish community beyond those expressly focused on hate that I find actually puzzling and upsetting.
Yair, you're as kind of a... Yair, you're deeply engaged in observing these communal politics. Do you agree with that, disagree with that? How would you respond?
Yeah, so I come from the journalistic world, so we get to say what we want. So I think I was the first person to write a story about Josh Mandel deciding to attack the ADL and side with a bunch of anti-Semites and conspiracy theorists. So I feel pretty good about some of the things, for instance, that Jewish journalists have done in covering these things. Similarly, I covered when Tamika Mallory, one of the leaders of the Women's March, came out and attacked the ADL for being involved in Starbucks, right? So these are very similar sorts of partisan attacks, score settling that was coming from the right and the left against a nonpartisan hate watchdog. And I wrote about them both. And again, it comes down to sort of, I do think that people should be willing to call out those both. And so I'd like to see, a certain amount of, solidarity, leadership, and so on. But I don't want to see the kind of leadership where if you disagree with my politics, I'll call it out. But if you don't, I'll just shrink into the foliage. So I would like to see some real backbone, and we'll see. I don't think that mainstream Jewish organizations, for the most part, wanted to let the ADL get walked all over. It's just not what they're used to doing. This is important to understand, right? We're living in a very new, unique political moment where a lot of things are happening that none of these organizations were built to deal with or ever expected to deal with. They were all thought will be nonpartisan organizations that work with whoever's in power, right, to be able to secure certain important needs and issues for the Jewish community and for the broader world. They never expected to get to the sort of extreme polarized state that we live in, where it's very hard to not take a stand on a lot of things. And they don't have staff, and they don't have rapid response teams, and they're not designed to deal with this issue. And I think you've seen with the ADL, and Jonathan can speak to this, that they've also had to adjust to living in this world, and it's a different world than it was 3 years ago.
Well, I would just object to one thing. I actually think that, and I wrote about this in my book, I actually think that some Jewish organizations like the American Jewish Committee were once built more to respond to this, that they had domestic policy programs, they had outreach programs, but those programs have atrophied over the last 20 years as they have become more and more focused on Israel as an issue almost unto itself. And because of the focus within so many Jewish organizations on Israel and not on what's happening in the United States, I think that a lot of the hatred that we're seeing now snuck up on the Jewish community, snuck up on mainline Jewish organizations, and I feel like they are not equipped to respond to join the Anti-Defamation League practically by design.
I think that, in a way, I don't disagree with that. I just think that there might not be something particularly unique about it. Like
About what?
About the fact that we have a lot of alphabet soup organizations in our community that take enormous donations, that pay their leaders huge amounts of money and basically don't do very much at all. I think that that's, it's true. I think that a lot of these organizations could disappear tomorrow and it would be a very, very good thing for our community. I think that
very Weiss, ladies and
gentlemen. This is why I'm in journalism. This is why I'm an opinion journalist, because I want to be able to say the truth. And I feel like oftentimes what you see from these organizations is a sort of quietism, and it frankly, it bothers me a lot. I think that there's just a lot of waste, and I don't really understand it.
Well, I want to say one note of caution, which is, again, sort of bad responses I get when I report about anti-Semitism. So one of the things is whenever we see racism of any sort or any sort of bigotry, right, the last people we should be criticizing for their response to it are the people targeted by it. So whatever one might think about this or that Jewish organization and so on, the fact is anti-Semitism isn't a Jewish problem, it's everyone else's problem. Just as Islamophobia is not a Muslim problem, it's all of our problem. And I find it very, very, actually very, very disorienting and frankly disturbing when somehow the conversation, which is really important about these things that people have finally started paying attention to, gets shifted to somehow what those groups are still doing wrong in their response to the things that people are doing to them. Doesn't make sense to me. People do it to the African American community a lot.
But I'm not blaming the victim.
This is more of a response to, I think, to what Jonathan was saying. And like, there's a separate issue.
What I'm trying to point out is that the Jewish community has accrued an amazing amount of wealth and power. And I find that often they are very, very hesitant to risk the capital they've built up, whether or not that's political, or in all sorts of ways.
How would you see them use it? So if you could wave your magic wand as an opinion journalist, what do you think, other than having a bunch of organizations, to use the term disappear, what would you have them do with that capital?
I mean, I'm saying that to be slightly provocative,
No,
but it's
I
sort
got
of,
it.
no, but I'm saying that,
provocative?
all I'm saying is that I look at the people that actually change the game and change the conversation, and often it's one brave person sticking their head up and saying the truth, and not a giant behemoth organization that's issuing a lot of press releases. That's all I'm saying.
That's fair.
When I think about just change, and how it happens, those are the people that I often see doing it, and I'm interested in them supporting.
Let me ask you a question on the issue of change. So one segment, I think, of society that hasn't changed in decades is the fringe left. So in the late 60s, after the Six-Day War, there was a segment of college students who started wearing keffiyehs, right? And we had the Nation of Islam saying crazy anti-Semitic things, and they kept saying it and saying it. But that group is pretty marginal, I would say.
Yeah, I want to.
So I'm gonna.
Let
Jonathan.
in the spirit of being jump in on that too, because I get Yair's and I get Bari's position. I get Yair's sense that we shouldn't be talking about one anti-Semitism of the left exclusively or the anti-Semitism of the right exclusively. But I do have to think that there is a place to think about movements. What is rising and what is not? I mean, the fact is that if he ever had power, Louis Farrakhan's power peaked in 1995 with the Million Man March. For the last 20 years, I think his power, his place in our political dialogue has not grown; it has shrunk. And I'm not. His form of anti-Semitism is as base and as gutter as David Duke's. But Louis Farrakhan cannot put 100,000 fascists on the streets of Budapest the way Orban can. Louis Farrakhan cannot orchestrate legislation in the Polish parliament making it illegal to suggest that Poles were involved in the Holocaust. Louis Farrakhan will not win a plurality of seats in the Italian parliament, and Louis Farrakhan will not be the runner-up to the presidency of France. But we are looking at a global movement on the nationalist right that is not reflected on the American left, but it is reflected on the far American right fringe. And that worries me, and I wonder if there is a place where we can actually rank threat.
Well, I would say that if you tell a story about European anti-Semitism and leave out the British Labour Party, where they literally just lost elections in Jewish areas because of the strong perception by lifetime Labour voters who were then on the record saying, Turkeys don't vote for Christmas, I can't vote for the Labour Party after doing it my whole life, right? So I don't think it's exclusive. I would absolutely argue, yes, that there's a much worse anti-Semitism problem in Europe than there is in America. And in point of fact, I worry about certain other prejudices much more in America right now today, for example, against Muslims or against immigrants, than I do against Jews, right? But I think that's very different,
with that too.
right? So I would say the Europe situation is a different conversation. But I don't like the idea that this anti-Semite, I have figured it out, he is fringe, the other one is not. Right? And I don't think we should ever talk about prejudice that way after the 2016 election. I think you could easily have had that conversation and said, well, David Duke, his power, it peaked that time when he ran for Senate in Louisiana, or, and then it didn't work. Right? And then after that, he's been just this irrelevant internet personality, right? And then suddenly, his successors come out as the alt-right, and suddenly they're the cresting wave, and Louis Farrakhan, he's yesterday, right? So I don't think that that's a very productive way to look at it. I think it's very often our anti-Semites on my team are fringe, their anti-Semites are the wave of the future.
And we also want to catch the cancer at stage 1 and not stage 4.
Oh, I mean, absolutely.
Like, meaning 20 years ago, people that were talking about rising anti-Semitism in Europe were dismissed as hysterical.
Right.
Well,
they were right.
I agree with you, Barry. And like when I start seeing an anti-Semitism of the left and rising out of anti-Zionism in our body politic, then I will say it. And like over this weekend, a woman named Leslie Coburn, who was Andrew Coburn's wife, just got the nomination as the Democrat to challenge a Republican in Virginia, and that was the first incidence I've seen of an anti-Zionist find a foothold in white Democratic politics. I've seen it in the black Democratic politics. And I will say this is something we should be vigilant for. We should look at it in all forms. Absolutely.
I think the way that it's functioning right now in terms of the right-left breakdown, although it's sort of sloppier than this, but I think the rise of anti-Semitism in the right, we're seeing it in the halls of political power.
Yes.
Okay? We're seeing it because anti-Semitism is not just a bigotry, it's a conspiracy theory. And Donald Trump doesn't have to be a bigot. I don't think that he has hatred of Jews in his heart. But the fact is he ran on a politics of conspiracy-minded thinking, that when he talked about globalism and the invisible hand and all the things, there's a reason that the Richard Spencers ran to his banner, because anti-Semitism functions as a conspiracy theory. So I think that you're right I want to be clear and really get it on the record that I'm extremely concerned about anti-Semitism on the right, and I think right now that that's happening in our politics. But I think what's difficult and maybe what's harder when it comes to anti-Semitism on the left is that it's in sort of our culture in a way, especially in the elite sort of culture, frankly, that we are all swimming in.
Yeah.
And I think that it comes in these sort of very subtle ways that it's hard to sort of call it out. Like we pointed out the ADL Starbucks thing. But there's a million examples that I can speak to, where we don't need to get into the college campus question, but there's a lot going on where sort of Jews are being excluded as Jews because they're not sufficiently pure.
I think that's correct. I think that's deeply correct.
Honestly, I wish that was a line that didn't generate applause. So we only have a few minutes left. So let's ask a question. So if you had the chance to give advice to the CEO of one of these alphabet soup organizations.
I love the ADL.
No.
I do.
That's focused on fighting anti-Semitism in all forms, right? Tell me, what advice would you give? Stated differently, what would you like an organization like ours to do to combat the threat as it's evolving today, based on what you've all experienced? And honestly, I think you are ideal to give this kind of counsel, because as journalists, you have a luxury and a perspective, a vantage point that few in the community really have.
I'll give advice that probably isn't strategic, but is what I'm moved by and what I think Jews throughout history are moved by. And it really begins with Abraham, the original iconoclast. Abraham smashed those idols and set off on the loneliest journey maybe in human history. And he changed the face of the universe by doing that. I think that we need to sort of look back into our history and be a little bit less concerned maybe about fitting in with the cultural mores of our time, which is honestly what I think that happens a lot once we sort of get into political power, and really focus on telling the truth and smashing the idols and risking being iconoclastic, even if it means polarizing. Polarizing is not always a bad thing. I think sometimes polarization, which has this sort of, negative stigma, can actually be quite positive.
Let's go to Yair, and then we'll close with Jonathan.
So, I mean, if I had the answer to this, I'd be in a much more lucrative business. But I do think about it a lot, and I also think about it. I spent a lot of time on this panel saying, here are all the wrong ways to fight anti-Semitism, so I ought to give you a positive answer. One of the ways, I think, to escape this sort of left-right fights that we get bogged down in when we talk about anti-Semitism is to start seeing anti-Semitism, as Bari said, as largely a conspiracy theory and fighting the misinformation that fuels conspiracy theories rather than focusing on a particular political community. Because, anti-Semitic videos that are all over YouTube, whether it's, Rothschild conspiracy theories, or, Louis Farrakhan stuff, or all these, or the various different manifestations of alt-right propaganda that are increasingly proliferating on online platforms. So these things are out there for anyone to pick up. And if you exist in a online universe where that sort of thing that's coming into your feed, right, you could be a totally normal, good person, and you could be persuaded that a Jewish banking dynasty controls the weather, which actually happened, and you could be an elected official and believe those things.
Yeah.
And then you can go to the Holocaust Museum and...
So, but the thing is, that's not a person who started out trying to go after Jews. It's a person who gave money, was involved with the Nation of Islam and Louis Farrakhan, gave money to them, and probably read the newspapers and watched the videos, and just absorbed this stuff without realizing what he was absorbing.
Yeah.
And I see this a lot. And if you can actually push back on conspiracy-minded thinking and the misinformation all around that fuels it, and I'm not saying this in terms of, therefore, get all these platforms to censor it, which is something I think is impractical and we can discuss about another time, but counter-information efforts, working with platforms to provide counter-information that gives people accurate pictures of the most prevalent conspiracy theories out there would be extremely helpful from the far left to the far right in decreasing people's susceptibility to this stuff.
So we've got smash the idols, right? Regardless of the, just
risk being iconoclastic.
Risk being iconoclastic. We've got counter the conspiracies, no matter where they're generated from. What will be your advice?
I think that when Jews stand up against anti-Semitism, when African Americans stand up against racism, when Muslims stand up against Islamophobia, there tends to be a reaction from out there saying, oh, you're just standing up for yourselves, or Black Lives Matter, or what do Blue Lives Matter, or there's always a counter response. And I think that the most powerful, cohesive way to stand up against hate is to stand up in coalitions. I think that Muslims, Jews, immigrants, African Americans need to stand together against bigotry and hatred. And I think that if you stand up as a coalition against hatred, you can't be accused of partisanship. It's insane to be called a partisan, to stand up for American values and for democratic pluralism, but you can't be a voice defending yourself. You have to be part of a coalition defending everyone.
I love that. And
that's an ad for the ADL. I love it.
I mean, and on that very powerful and I think wise note, I want to thank Jonathan, Bari, and Yair for giving so much of your time today. Thank you so much.